Emil Ludwig Louis Holmdahl, August 26, 1883 to April 8, 1963, was an American soldier of fortune, infantryman, machine gunner, spy, gun runner, and treasure hunter who fought under Frederick Funston and John J. Pershing in the Spanish-American War and subsequent Philippine-American War, Philippine Insurrection, under Lee Christmas in Central America, under Francisco Madero, Pancho Villa, and Venustiano Carranza in the Mexican Revolution, and under John J. Pershing again in World War I. In 1926, Holmdahl was accused of having stolen Francisco Pancho Villa's head. Early life. Emil Ludwig Louis Holmdahl was born on August 26, 1883, in the Swedetown area of Fort Dodge, Iowa, to Swedish-American parents, Frank Emil Holmdahl, and his wife, Cecilia Andrina Olsen, the sixth of 7, possibly 8 children. His siblings were Amanda Esther Holmdahl, 1875 to 1819, Andrew Lysiris Holmdahl, 1876 to 1819, August Emanuel Holmdahl, 1878 to 1819, Monville A. Monty Holmdahl, 1879 to 1956, Hedvig Nathaniel Edward Holmdahl, 1881 to 1955, and Minnie A. Holmdahl, 1886 to 1968. Both of his parents were immigrants from Sweden. His father worked for the Fort Dodge Gas and Electric Company, as did 2 of his brothers, although they lived a rural farming lifestyle. Little is known about Holmdahl's early life, but he appears to be something of an adventurous but troublesome child, often getting into trouble with his school and authorities. According to Douglas V. Mead, a historian and expert on 19th and early 20th century American history, Holmdahl loved Rudyard Kipling's stories and tales of exotic battle. His father left home when he was young to start a new family in California, as he had done this previously in St. Paul, Minnesota. His father's escapades may have influenced Holmdahl's extraordinary wanderlust that resulted in the life that he would lead later in life. The young Holmdahl did not get much of a formal education, although he learned to read and to write, and would be known for his exquisite handwriting and signature. U.S. military service. Spanish-American War. Emil Holmdahl, at age 15, enlisting in the Army to fight in the Spanish-American War. Emil Holmdahl was perhaps destined to live an uneventful life, but the Spanish-American War had broken out in 1898, shortly after the USS Maine exploded off the coast of Cuba, and U.S. President McKinley had issued a call of arms requesting 50,000 volunteers to bolster the regular army. However, the Army would eventually receive 220,000, vastly higher than the requested 50,000. Holmdahl was overcome with a new sense of adventure and patriotism and wanted to take part. Holmdahl's older brother Monty had already enlisted, but Holmdahl was only 15 years old and was 2 years off from being allowed to enlist at the minimum age of 17. Holmdahl desperately wanted to join the war, however, and went to a recruiting office to enlist, where a grizzled sergeant could tell he was underage and told him to wait a few years. Holmdahl knew the war would be over by then, and acting with his usual confidence that would make him famous in the future, he took his small amount of savings and went to a different recruiting office. He hired a man to act as his father and had him tell the recruiters that he was of age. The plan worked, and he successfully enlisted in the 51st Iowa Volunteer Infantry Regiment as a rifleman. Men of the 51st Iowa Volunteer Regiment at Camp McKinley. The 1st 51st was currently mustered at Des Moines, Iowa, under the command of Colonel John T. Loper, and began training and homing their skills at Camp McKinley. In May, the regiment had received orders to travel west to San Francisco, join the Philippine campaign, and by May 30th, the regiment consisted of 50 officers and 789 enlisted men. The 51st set out toward San Francisco by train in groups, with portions of the regiment leaving Des Moines on June 5th and the entire regiment arriving by the 11th. Holmdahl and the 51st were first sent to Camp Merritt, and shortly afterwards to Camp Merriam at the Presidio, the military base close to the San Francisco harbor, which by now consisted of 50 officers and 1,336 enlisted men. Holmdahl and the 51st spent 4.5 months training there and acclimating to life as volunteer soldiers, primarily preparing for the Philippines. Morale was high among the 51st, as conditions were relatively luxurious, as they were able to sleep in tents with rubber blankets on bottom, wool on top, good rations, and even got to participate in football games with other units. The team from the 51st, Iowa, which may have contained Holmdahl, beat Berkeley 6-0. While in California, the regiment received news of the armistice in the Philippines on August 13, 1898, immediately after the Battle of Manila, which was to the great annoyance of Holmdahl, who was not happy to miss out on the action. After months in California, the morale began to fade, as disease began to make its way to the 51st, and 2 soldiers, Private Barton J. Brown, aged 18, and Private Lewis Dunn, aged 23, died from disease, which foreshadowed things to come, and the regiment would lose 27 men to disease before even leaving for the Philippines. Philippine-American War. Emil Holmdahl during the Philippine insurrection. Despite the armistice, in October, the regiment had orders to sail to the Philippines for an 8-month-long deployment. Holmdahl and the 51st began disassembling camp and packing their equipment and gear for the long trip overseas. The 51st broke camp on November 3rd at 9 p.m. and marched outside the Lombard Gate of the Presidio and boarded the transport ship SS Pennsylvania, a hastily converted freighter with cramped quarters, inadequate ventilation, and few amenities. Most of the regiment suffered from seasickness as they set out towards Manila, which they arrived offshore on December 7th and remained on ship. On December 10th, the U.S. and Spain signed an official treaty in Paris, formally ceding the Philippines to the U.S., much to the outrage of the Filipino locals, who wished for an independent Philippine. The regiment then finally received orders to land at the port city of Iloilo, on the island of Panay. The 51st on the Pennsylvania sailed out of Manila Bay on December 26th, escorted by the cruiser Baltimore and 2 troop ships, and would raise anchor offshore of Iloilo on the same day. It soon became apparent that occupying Iloilo would not be as easy as it seems, as local Filipino insurrectionists took control of the island and occupied Iloilo. 8 days later, the regiment received orders to attack and capture the city. Holmdahl and the 51st, along with units of the 6th U.S. Field Artillery, climbed down from the sides of the Pennsylvania and were transported onto the beach. The Filipinos had fortified and barricaded the coast and were in a highly defensible position, and after a brief wait, Colonel Loper decided to abandon the attack, and the 51st in company returned to their ship. They were next sent to Cavite, near Manila, where they were finally allowed to go into quarters on February 3rd. 51st Iowa Volunteer Regiment in the Philippines.
Philippine-American War. Main article, Philippine-American War. Emil Holmdahl during the Philippine insurrection. Despite the armistice, in October the regiment had orders to sail to the Philippines for an 8-month-long deployment. Holmdahl and the men began to disassemble camp and packing their equipment and gear for the long trip overseas. The 51st broke camp on November 3rd at 9 p.m. and marched outside the Lombard Gate of the Presidio and boarded the transport ship SS Pennsylvania, a hastily converted freighter with cramped quarters, inadequate ventilation, and few amenities. Most of the regiment suffered from seasickness as they set out towards Manila, which they arrived offshore on December 7th and remained on ship. On December 10th, the U.S. and Spain signed an official treaty in Paris, formally ceding the Philippines to the U.S., much to the outrage of the Filipino locals who wished for an independent Philippine. The regiment then finally received orders to land on the port city of Iloilo, on the island of Panay. The 51st on the Pennsylvania sailed out of Manila Bay on December 26th, escorted by the cruiser Baltimore and 2 troop ships, and would raise anchor offshore of Iloilo on the same day. It soon became apparent that occupying Iloilo would not be as easy as it seems, as local Filipino insurgents took control over the island and occupied Iloilo. 8 days later, the regiment received orders to attack and capture the city. Holmdahl and the 51st began preparing for their first battle by sharpening their bayonets and cleaning their outdated .45-70 Springfield rifles. Holmdahl and the 51st, alongside units of the 6th U.S. Field Artillery, climbed down from the sides of the Pennsylvania and were transported onto the beach. The Filipinos had fortified and barricaded the coast and were in a highly defensible position. And after a brief wait, Colonel Loper decided to abandon the attack, and the 51st and Company returned to their ship. They were next sent to Cavite, near Manila, where they were finally allowed to go into quarters on February 3rd. The 51st Iowa Volunteers Regiment in the Philippines. The Philippine-American War formally began on February 4th when Private William Walter Grayson of the 1st Nebraska Volunteer Infantry fired at men carrying rifles, igniting the Second Battle of Manila. On February 9, 1899, the 51st advanced, making preparation for their first engagement. Their objective was to advance on San Roque, southwest of Manila, and nearby Cavite. They had initially suspected Cavite would be attacked by the Filipinos from San Roque, so waited until no attack came, and then fortified the town, and then, alongside the Wyoming Light Battery and the Nevada Cavalry, with batteries A and D of the California Heavy Artillery, defeated the Filipinos on the causeway of San Roque. They next went east, where on March 5th they fought in the Battle of Guadalupe Church under the command of Brig General Lloyd Wheaton. Shortly afterwards, the 51st were transferred to the 2nd Brigade, 2nd Division of the same corps on April 14th, where they took part in the general advance against the Filipinos to the north of Manila, arriving at Malolos a day later on April 15th. Holmdahl and the rest of his regiment later took part in the Battle of Quingua and battles of East and West Pulilan on April 24th. The next day, on the 25th, Holmdahl and his regiment fought at the Bogbog River during the first of 2 battles of Calampit. The 51st then proceeded to play a major role during the Battle of Santo Tomas on May 4th. The 51st and other units successfully captured San Fernando during May 4th to 5th. Following this, Holmdahl and his unit fought in many different skirmishes around San Fernando from May 15th to July 4th. The 2nd Bionic was finally given orders to and take Angeles north of San Fernando, and on August 9th they advanced to Calulit, which fell, and then on the same day. The 51st began fighting around Angeles, but then were assigned guard duty at Calulit, while Angeles would eventually fall on November 5, 1899. The Battle of Angeles was considered to be the longest in the history of the Philippine-American War in Pampanga. The 51st served their guard duty until September 6th, where, having completed their 8-month deployment, they returned to Manila and went into their quarters at Cuartel de España. The 51st Iowa Volunteers had 47 enlisted men killed in action, 22 officer and 331 enlisted wounded, 34 to 39 men dead of disease, not including the 27 dead before leaving California. 1 officer committed suicide, while only 1 deserted. Holmdahl, instead of returning to San Francisco via the transport Senator, chose to remain in the Philippines, as he was still yearning for adventure. Kuong, Royal Guard, and Boxer Rebellion. Main article, Boxer Rebellion. Main article, Chinese Empire Reform Association. Map of China during Boxer Rebellion.
The now 16-year-old Holmdahl then joined with the forces of mercenary General Edmund F. English, who was recruiting a foreign legion of experienced soldiers to help modernize the army of Qing dynasty, with the backing of the Chinese Empire Reform Association, a group of Western-oriented Chinamen and San Francisco businessmen. Their mission was to aid Empress Zhu Cixi in putting down a series of rebellions. The men recruited by English were described by Meade as discharged soldiers, wharf rats, and European freebooters, and formed the regiment known as the Royal Imperial Guards, Senem Order of Dragoons, which would serve as both shock troops and royal bodyguards. Holmdahl was commissioned in the regiment as an ensign, possibly due to his exquisite handwriting and flair for expressing himself. The regiment, having successfully recruited a decent force, set sail to China. The regiment arrived at the Shanghai harbor just in time for the situation to increase tenfold. Many Chinese were angered by the involvement of foreigners in Chinese affairs, and dissent began to grow. They eventually decided they've had enough and united, later forming a group known by the Europeans as the Boxers. They began to attack and kill foreigners by the hundreds, initiating the Boxer Rebellion, a collection of foreign states to fight the Boxers. The Boxers forced Empress Cixi to sever relation with the foreigners, and this left the regiment without money, and the men quickly dissolved into a collection of drifters in Shanghai. Luckily for Holmdahl, he had managed to win a ticket back to the Philippines.
Insurgents and Moro Rebellion. Main article, Moro Rebellion. Now back in the Philippines, Holmdahl heard news that the military was offering a $500 enlistment bonus to enlist in the regular army, so Holmdahl enlisted in the 20th Infantry Regiment as a private in Company I. The regulars had benefits over the volunteers, as they had access the modern Norwegian-designed Krag Jorgensen bolt-action rifle, which had a 5-shot magazine, fired a high-velocity .30-40 caliber cartridge, and used smokeless powder, which the volunteer standard .45-70 Springfield rifle did not. The gun also had a range of 2,000 yards, 1,800 meters, and Holmdahl quickly established himself as an excellent marksman. The regular army also had the added benefit of better gear, equipment, and rations, while pay was guaranteed. Holmdahl and his unit fought in a short but fierce skirmish at Salsona, Luzon. In November 1901, Holmdahl's unit was put under the command of General J. Franklin Bell and were given the task of pacifying the remaining insurgents still resisting American dominion. Sergeant Holmdahl, far left standing, during Moro Rebellion with men of the 20th Infantry. Holmdahl and the 20th were sent to Jolo Island to help secure the island, and then to Jolo City itself, where they would take part in the Third Sulu Expedition against the Sultanate of Sulu. The war was brutal, with large-scale atrocities on both sides. The Philippine insurrection was officially declared over by President Theodore Roosevelt and soon evolved into the bloody Moro Rebellion. After a series of short but brutal battles, Holmdahl had distinguished himself and was promoted to corporal, as well as earning a certificate that declared him proficient in the drill regulations of 1904. The war took a more personal turn, Holmdahl, when 4 of his friends in the 20th, including Sergeant John McDermott, were brutally killed in the village of Talai, while another was wounded. Holmdahl next fought against Datu Hassan, the youngest son of the great Raja Muda Amang, during the Hassan uprising. In April 1905, Datu Pala, the chief of Sulu, invaded Jolo during the Battle of Maihum. Pala's attack failed, with 250 men, including Pala himself, being killed, while only 7 Americans were killed and 20 wounded. In March, when Holmdahl fought during the First Battle of Buddajo. The now 21-year-old Holmdahl then fought in the battles of Tambang Market, Ipalang, and Palas Kota, during which he earned much renown and recognition. Holmdahl's service records had a note stating, "This soldier has a military ability and zeal to fit him for a commission as an officer of a unit of United States Volunteers."
Holmdahl would be promoted to sergeant of Company I on December 15th at only age 22. In March 1906, the 20th Infantry would finally return to the U.S. aboard the troop ship USS Sheridan. Holmdahl having served 8 months in the 51st Iowa Volunteers and 6 years in the 20th while in the Philippines. Citation needed. Throughout the years of combat in the Far East, Holmdahl had become an expert marksman, a daredevil counterinsurgency fighter, and committed to a soldier's career. Holmdahl had also learned valuable skills on machine gunning, which would prove greatly beneficial later in life. San Francisco earthquake. U.S. soldiers on guard duty amid the ruins of San Francisco, 1906. Holmdahl is second from the right. Having returned to San Francisco, he began to enjoy the pleasures of the infamous Barbary Coast red light district while on leave from his post at Monterey. This was not to last, as within a month of arriving in California, a massive 7.9 magnitude tremendous earthquake and subsequent fires virtually destroyed San Francisco on April 18, 1906. Holmdahl was eventually able to get to his duty station at Monterey, where he was immediately sent back to the front lines of the smoldering remains of the city to rescue residents and maintain order, mainly from looters. It was worse than soldiering in the Philippine Islands. I was on guard at the United States Sub-Treasury building for 125 hours with little sleep, Holmdahl commented on his service in San Francisco. The troops were withdrawn after order was successfully brought to the destroyed city. Holmdahl and the rest of the 20th returned to their posts at Monterey, wherein Holmdahl would on free time from his usual duties play baseball. He was quite good, as on Thanksgiving Day he played second base for a team of enlisted which beat officers 12-2, while on December 6th he was winning pitcher on the Company I team which defeated Company H, and finally on December 13th he pitched for the team that beat Monterey High School. Holmdahl received an honorary discharge on January 31, 1907.
Central America. Oakland Steamfitter and Banana Wars. Main article, Banana Wars. Map of Central America, 1908. Immediately following his discharge, Holmdahl moved to Oakland, California, where he worked as a steamfitter, installing and maintaining pipes. He spent only 2 weeks at his new job, as he was left dissatisfied and bored. The life of a steamfitter was nowhere near as exciting as during his time overseas, and he resolved to once again find a profession where he could see action and have an adventure. Much of his personal actions during this time are unknown, as no written sources exist. However, it is known that Holmdahl was certainly involved in the many wars and revolutions, but how or when is not. Holmdahl was probably recruited in either Oakland or in San Francisco and made his way to New Orleans on the Gulf of Mexico. Once there, he boarded a banana boat and made his way to the Nicaraguan port city of Bluefields, where he made his way to Honduras through tick-infested mountains and malaria-ridden jungles, and from where he joined the forces of American mercenary General Lee Christmas. Service under Lee Christmas. Main article, Lee Christmas. General Lee Christmas in Central America. Lee Christmas was a Louisiana native and railroad man who eventually traveled to Honduras and later became a mercenary, enthusiastically supporting the revolutionary and future president Manuel Bonilla. He would later become a high-ranking officer and commander of Bonilla's army, leading a large group of American mercenaries, which now included Holmdahl. Lee Christmas was in need of men with skill who could operate the new machine guns which were recently brought to Central America by foreigners. During 1907, the dictator of Nicaragua, José Santos Zelaya, invaded Honduras to establish his own man, Miguel Davila, to the presidency. Holmdahl probably fought alongside Christmas and Bonilla during the invasion and during a 1907 battle with Christmas against Zelaya. The arrival of machine guns by the Nicaraguans tipped the war in Zelaya's favor, and Bonilla and Christmas went into exile. Homdahl may have fled back to New Orleans alongside Christmas or continued fighting in various conflicts throughout the region. He possibly fought in the War of 1907 between El Salvador on one side and Nicaragua and Davila's Honduras on one side. When Christmas invaded Honduras yet again to oust Davila, Homdahl likely took part in that campaign. The war lasted little over a year before Christmas and Bonilla defeated Davila and retook control of Honduras. Invasion of Nicaragua. José Santos Zelaya, President of Nicaragua. Homdahl and other mercenaries next went into Nicaragua to remove Zelaya from power, supported by Bonilla, Christmas, and possibly the U.S. government, who were unhappy with Zelaya, who was considering constructing a canal across the Nicaragua Isthmus, which would compete with the Panama Canal being worked on by the Americans. Homdahl probably took part in the fighting alongside the San Juan River, where two American mercenaries, Leroy Cannon and Leonard Gross, were captured and later executed by firing squad, which only inspired more Americans to come to join the conflict. Christmas at some point promoted Homdahl to an officer, according to a 1913 interview. During this time, Homdahl became acquainted with other legendary soldiers of fortunes and mercenaries, Sam Drebin, the Fighting Jew, who would fight in dozens of wars and would become one of the most decorated Americans during World War I, Tracy Richardson, the world's greatest machine gunner, who would single-handedly capture the city of Managua and would fight in World War I for the Canadians and the Americans in World War II, Edward Tex O'Reilly, who fought in dozens of wars and later became a famous war correspondent, Guy Machine Gun Maloney, who left home at age 16 to fight in the Boer War and would become a colonel in the U.S. Army. There is evidence to suggest Homdahl fought in Cuba and Venezuela, and he may have returned to Central America to fight during the 1910 invasion of Honduras and unquestionably during the 1911 invasion and the resulting Battle of La Ceiba, which made Lee Christmas famous. A story in the El Paso Times later reported that Homdahl made his way to New Orleans and then joined a filibuster expedition for South America with a shipload of ammunition. The ship circled Cape Horn and landed its cargo at Manzanillo in the Mexican state of Colima. The soldier of fortune then went to Los Angeles, where he joined a junta planning a revolt in Mexico. In 1909, the 26-year-old Homdahl decided to return to the U.S. Early involvement in Mexico. Magonista Rebellion and Spy Mission. Main article: Magonista Rebellion of 1911. Map of Sonora, northwestern Mexico, 1911. Mexico had been in an ongoing form of instability and political anarchy due to many factors, among them the iron fist rule of dictator Porfirio Diaz. Homdahl's first actions are unknown, but he likely went into Mexico immediately following returning from Central America and probably became a member of the growing Magonista movement under the leadership of Ricardo Flores Magón. Upon his return to the States, Homdahl answered an ad that simply read, "Wanted a man with military experience who had nerve and is single." Homdahl listed his military experience and was invited to attend many midnight interviews in the shady side of the town, after which he received an envelope containing a $100 bill and brought to meet several Mexican revolutionaries who were plotting against the Diaz regime. Homdahl was asked to smuggle arms and ammunition into Mexico while posing as a mining expert. Homdahl was given plenty of money and a revolver by the revolutionary junta and traveled to Nogales, Arizona, where he crossed the border and boarded a train for 500 miles south to the city of Culiacan, the capital of Sinaloa. He purchased a horse and saddle and went south on the Tortilla Trail. It got its name as there's nothing to eat except the tortillas you brought with you. After the 100-mile trek across the plain, Holmdahl arrived at the west coast port city of Mazatlan, where he made contacts and spent his spare time improving his Spanish before finally traveling to the revolutionary objective of Tepic, the capital of Nayarit. Holmdahl, acting as a wealthy representative of a New York mining company, had managed to gain entry into the governor's palace by telling the governor that he was interested in purchasing good property and promised good money that would be available in exchange for help. Holmdahl was easily able to charm the governor, who invited him back for dinner. Now having secured the governor's confidence, he was able to learn the number of men and amount of arms and ammunition of the pro-Diaz forces, while the governor at Point even showed Holmdahl the location of where some of the secret ammo and weapons were. Holmdahl forwarded this message to the revolutionary junta back in Los Angeles. Bad news came to Holmdahl when several revolutionaries and spies were arrested and then promptly executed, which the governor said was to put fear in the people. Holmdahl, on the pretext of surveying timberland on the coast, spent 9 days searching for potential landing spots for which he could smuggle arms and ammunition into Mexico by sea. Once Holmdahl returned to the capital, a man told him that the governor had been tipped off that he was a spy, and told him he should gather his things and leave. Holmdahl apprehensively returned to his room to gather his belongings, but once he reached his room, he noticed that the Mexican Rurale police were surrounding the building. Holmdahl successfully snuck into the hotel patio and then used his leather lariat to lasso an overhanging waterspout and managed to pull himself up. Holmdahl began escaping the town by jumping across rooftops until he reached the end and lowered himself to the ground, but by sheer coincidence ran to a dozen policemen. The police, too, were surprised, and Holmdahl swiftly withdrew his revolver and killed a policeman with a single shot to the head. Holmdahl began a fighting retreat as he ran towards the corral, where he hoped he could find the fastest steed in the city. Holmdahl did just that and rode out onto the street, while the Rurales, with horses of their own, began a pursuit. Holmdahl noticed a crowd and rode into them as he had hoped the Rurales wouldn't fire into a crowd. The Rurales had little regard for the people who they were supposed to serve and fired into the crowd anyway. Bullets came close to Holmdahl on several occasions, while many civilians were killed and even more wounded by the Rurales. Holmdahl would later write, "A fat priest came out of the church and waved his hands at me. I fired not at him, but at the stained glass window just above his head and shattered the glass. If you ever saw a scared fat priest make a quick retreat, that toad made grand time. I bet he called me a few things not in the good book." Tepic, Mexico, 1909. Holmdahl continued fleeing down the cobbled street and was able to outrun the police due to his horse being faster than that of the Rurales. However, just as he was leaving the town, the Rurales fired a final volley which injured his horse. Holmdahl then went over into a corral where he stole a horse from a local rancher. With the new horse, he was able to escape his pursuers, and for 4 days he lived on the land, stole horses, and slept in the saddle until he reached a hot spring near the village of Tuxpan, where, feeling drowsy and ill, he chose to dismount and fall asleep. Holmdahl was awakened by a Mauser carbine coming down upon his foot, and he jokingly told the Rurale commander, "Some race, huh?" To which the Rurale commander responded, "Your gringo sense of humor is replaced." Holmdahl was cuffed and then stabbed in his leg with a knife.